Welcome to another exercise for the workbook Statistics. This time I'm going to talk about measures of central tendency and in particular the calculation of quantiles or percentiles. And well, here we're going to do this for classified data sets. In particular, we're asked about the first quartile as well as the 35% percentile and the 57% percentile. And we have to do this for this data set and for that data set. So let's consider the first data set. I'm just going to copy this again up here. If we're going to work with, well, classified data, and we have to calculate something related to quantiles or quartiles or percentiles, in the first step, we're going to need the relatively accumulated frequencies. Because, well, if we start with the first quartile is the 25% percentile. So we're going to check out at which point the relative accumulated frequency becomes larger than 25%. And that's actually here in this class. So this class is the first one where the relative accumulated frequency is larger than the 25% describing the first quartile. So that's what we call then our quartile or quantile class. You might have heard the term median class. That's a similar fashion. So that's the class we're going to use for the calculation. Then we're going to start with the lower bound of this class. That's the 50 plus the 25% from the quartile minus the relative accumulated frequency from the class before, so the one up here, the 0.1154, and we're going to divide it by the relative frequency of this relevant class, which here is 0.2. Finally, we're going to multiply this fraction with the width of the class. The width of the class is simply upper bound minus lower bound. So 100 minus 50 gives me this 50 here. If I put all of this into calculator, I get 83.65. Well, then we're going to repeat the step for the other two percentiles. So here first for the 35% percentile. But the idea is more or less the same. So here we're working with 0.35. Let's check. Okay, it's still smaller, still smaller. So the third class is actually the first one larger than 35% regarding its relative accumulated frequency. So this is the class we consider here. So we're going to take the lower bound of the class plus the 0.35 minus the relatively accumulated frequency of the class before. Well, that's the relevant class here. So the relative accumulated frequency from before is the 0.3154. And we're going to divide this by the relative frequency of the class we're going to consider here, which is this one. That's what we divide by. So this one minus relative accumulated frequency from before divided by relative frequency of the current class. Again, multiplied with the width of the class, which is upper bound minus lower bound. 200 minus 100, giving us this 100 here. And a total 35% percentile of 109.57. Then, the third value, we also have to go with the 57% percentile. Well, if we look closely, that's the same class as before, so it's still the third class. So we have the same starting value here, but we have here, instead of the 35%, 57%. All the other values are exactly the same because it's exactly the same class. The only difference at this point is the value we have here, describing which percentile we're actually working with. So if we calculate this, we get as a result 170.43. Well, that was already part A, the first of the two classified data sets. So let's consider the second of the two data sets, this table up here. Again, we're going to start with the first quartile, the 0.25 quantile, 25% quantile. Checking the data, the first class is still smaller regarding the relatively accumulated frequencies, but the second one is larger. So that's the class we're going to consider here. That's the quartile class we need. We're going to start with the lower bound, the 800, then plus the 0.25, from this being the 25% percentile, minus relatively accumulated frequencies of the class before, divided by relative frequency of the class in question, times the width of the class. Width, again, upper bound minus lower bound, 1200 minus 800, giving us the 400 here. And in total, I will get a first quartile of 1044.5. So that's the first part. Then we have to continue with the 35% percentile. So let's check again which of the classes is the first one with a relatively accumulated frequency larger than 35%. Well, incidentally, it's again the same class, the second one. So we can copy more or less all of these values except for that one. Here we're going to write 0.35 because we're working with the 35% percentile. Rest stays the same, so as an end result we get 1195.62. Leaving us with only one percentile to calculate, that's the 57% percentile. Then we're going to check again the relatively accumulated frequencies. This one's smaller, that one's smaller, that's actually larger. So we're going to work with the third class in this case. Going to take the lower bound of the class plus 0.57 from this percentile minus the relatively accumulated frequency of the class before. So before, that's the second class, that one, divided by the relative frequency of the class in question, that's that one here, multiplied with the class width, which is just upper minus lower bound, so 2500 minus 1200 gives 1300. In total, I will get as a result 1815.15. Well, that's it. So the schematic we're going to use is always the same. So actually, I would say quantiles, percentiles for classified data is much easier than for unclassified data, because here we can always use exactly the same formula. With unclassified data, we actually have to consider, do we get an integer result, non-integer result, have to then use a different formula. Here, it's always the same formula. The only thing which I have to decide first is which class to work with. So which is the class which for the first time achieves a relative accumulated frequency larger than the percentage value in question. Well, this concludes this unit, so I hope you enjoyed it. I say goodbye and see you next time.